Supposed to rain
Hopefully it was a good walk.
It was awesome. It's great.
Was it a productive walk?
I just there was a block around here. Yeah, it was
Nice.
good. Yeah,
Good.
about 25. Yeah, it's all good.
You were kind of out of breath. It was only a block.
Oh,
exactly.
Susan.
Exactly.
There's
Oh, my
Narsandic
God.
coming in.
Exactly.
Just a concern.
I think Mayor, I think there's a mute
Wow.
button there.
Exactly.
Yeah, don't
What
you
is
have the
that
mute
thing?
button controls?
Oh, that's good. Okay, I see ya. Okay,
I
hold on,
should
hold on.
join the mayor then.
Exactly.
All right, Mayor, we are live on Facebook, YouTube, and Channel 21.
Great. Okay. Let's see here. Special meeting. There we are. Okay, there we go, everybody. All right. So hold on, everybody. Hold on. Okay. Well, everybody, welcome to the April 6th, 2021 special meeting of the Federal Way City Council. We've got a great agenda to get started off with, but before we do that, we should do the Pledge of Allegiance. Would you all please rise for the pledge? I pledge allegiance
Religions.
to the flag
To
of
the flag.
the United States of
United
America
States of
of the United States of America
and to the republic
and to the
Republic.
republic
for which it stands,
for which it
Stands.
stands,
one nation,
one nation,
One nation.
under God,
under God,
Under God.
indivisible,
indivisible,
Divisible.
with liberty and justice for all.
With liberty and justice
And
for all.
justice for all.
All right, we're getting better. Practice makes perfect. Okay, everybody. So tonight's agenda, we've got 3 items on here, essentially all related, and they are summary of impact findings regarding the OMF, the Operation and Maintenance Facility sites, the 2 in Federal Way and the 3rd in Midway. We'll have, I'll introduce staff Ryan Medlin, the city liaison to Sound Transit, and then we'll have consultant review and report from FCS. The next item, item B, will be the summary of technical comments prepared by city staff, and we'll have EJ, our Public Works Director, and Ryan Medlin again. And then a council discussion, item C, the city council discussion and review of a draft letter to Sound Transit. It's council business item 7C, I believe, on the April 6th, 2021, today's date, regular meeting agenda. With that, I will turn it over to Ryan. Ryan, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Mayor, and good evening. Council President and council members, welcome. So if we could start today, I'm going to introduce Gordon Wilson and Tim Wood with the FCS group. We contracted with them last year when the OMF scoping was getting wrapped up, and it was apparent we had 2 sites in Federal Way that we needed to be concerned with. They did an independent analysis as to some of the employment and fiscal implications of these potential sites. I do want to note that in this presentation, most of the info is based on some of the older boundaries when this was originally taking shape, but they're also working with the DEIS boundaries to try and hone in on the more precise figures. But since everything about the boundaries themselves is fluid, they have some important information to present to us. And later this month, they will be also providing us with a second memo that gives us some input as to the opportunity costs that may be involved with either of these sites for the city and sort of the longer term implications from a land use fiscal standpoint. And we will take this information and incorporate it into our technical review letter to Sound Transit no later than the April 19th close of public comment period. So with that, Gordon, I will let you take the show.
Right. And I even remembered to unmute myself. Can I share my screen? Can you see my screen right now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
All right. And I'll move on through. What I'll do is summarize the contents of the memo of the impact of the Sound Transit OMF South on the city of Federal Way. As you know, there are 3 potential sites under consideration, and 1 is in Kent and 2 are in Federal Way. our analysis was focused on the two in Federal Way. And our goal is to show the impact of those two sites. One of them is a site 325th or whatever. It's a CFC site, Community Christian Faith Center site. It's predominantly owned by the CFC. It includes a church, school, community facility. It also includes some vacant land in the upper northeast part of that quadrant there. It's about 53 acres. There's also a 344th Street site, which is to the south in that you can see it in the green shaded area, and that has about 52 different parcels and a variety of businesses and some single family homes. The purple area in the middle is shared between both sites. As Ryan mentioned, since this analysis was developed last year, Sound Transit changed the configuration of the 344th Street site to a north-south orientation. So this particular map shows the original 344. This map shows how it has changed, or it shows the current one. The reddish boundary is the current 344 site. And so it now runs along the proposed light rail tracks and the freeway. And it takes out, there's more shared land right now in the current version. We just got that DEIS just a few weeks ago. We're in the process of updating the numbers, but the numbers in this particular presentation will refer to the last year's analysis. But my guess is that, well, I'll tell you how I think the numbers will change when we get to that point. Our focus is on the revenue impacts, and then the employment impacts and the impact on some vacant developable lands. The types of revenues, before I move on, let me just describe some of the major types of revenues. We've got property tax revenue coming into the city, also going to the fire district and the school districts and other local governments. Because that's relevant because Sound Transit is a tax exempt government. It would not be paying property taxes. We also have local retail sales tax. And because particularly in the 344th site, some of the businesses have retail sales, there would be an impact on the sales tax. There would also be an impact on state shared revenues. That consists of the liquor excise tax, liquor control board profits, motor vehicle fuel tax, and the multimodal transportation tax and criminal justice distribution. Those are all population-based revenue. And because the OMF would reduce the population living in the area, there is some residential currently, and that would be reduced through by an OMF. So there's an impact on that type of revenue also. There would also be a potential impact on surface water fees. And those do not go to the general fund. They go to the fund that is dedicated for the maintenance of the surface water system. But we do include that in our analysis. So those are some of the main types of revenues we're talking about. The current sites under consideration are, to the left is the 336th Street site. That's the CFC site. And that's an east-west site, and it goes all the way to Pacific Highway. And so this is a big development. And then the 344 site now is oriented north-south, and it would run alongside the freeway, actually alongside the tracks, which are alongside the freeway. In the revised orientation, you can see the Christian Faith Center building in the upper right, right there. And that would be spared barely, but it would be spared in the revised orientation. However, the area across the street that is owned by CFC, right around here, would become part of the OMF facility. And that area is zoned multifamily and could be potentially developed in the future. The property tax, right now, both sites contribute to local taxing jurisdictions. The 344 site has more of an impact on the property tax than the CFC site. The 344 site contributes about $550,000 per year to a variety of local taxing jurisdictions. And about $48,000 a year of that goes to the city. The CFC site is about $91,000 a year. It's a lot less than the 344 site because a bunch of it is land for a church, which is tax exempt just as the OMF site would be. And so only about $8,000 goes to the city from the CFC site. The majority of the taxable property in the CFC site is in that shared area. So you can see that the impact of the 344 site would be greater than that of the CFC site. Sales tax, it's a similar situation. Both sites include some retail businesses, but the 344 site contains in a light industrial area. Actually, it's Federal Way's only industrial area really that has some businesses, and they do generate sales tax. And there's about 19 million in retail sales, generating about $161,000 per year in state and local sales tax. The CFC site does have some sales tax, but not nearly as much, about 9.3 million total in sales and just under 80,000 in tax revenues. Once again, the 344 site has a bigger impact. State share revenues, remember, are distributed based on population. And there are 74, according to the best data we had as of last year, there's 74 residents living in the 344th Street footprint. And that generated about $5,000 per year. 18 Federal Way residents live in the CFC footprint, most of them in the shared area. And that brings the city about $1,200 per year. The surface water fee is charged based on the amount of impervious surface area and is dedicated to the management of the surface water system. There are about 1.3 million square feet of impervious surface area in the 344th footprint. That generates about $40,000 in those fees. There's about 1 million, just under 1 million impervious square feet in the CFC footprint. And that results in about 30,000 generated there. The shared footprint is about 5,000 of the total to both sides. So once again, the 344 site contributes more to surface water fees. And the estimates of an impervious surface area for an OMF are not available, but it's reasonable to guess that it would be pretty similar. This is a type of revenue that I wouldn't worry too much about based on the numbers I'm seeing here. Because a developed OMF will have a lot of impervious surface. So the total, between all the identified revenue sources, the 344 footprint generates a little over $250,000 per year for the city and about almost $520,000 per year for all government entities. For the CFC site, it's about $118,000, just a little less than half for the city, and about $161,000 for all government entities. The shared footprints of about $13,000 of that. And you can see those numbers here. Again, the shared footprint is there. It's informational, but that number is not subtracted from the other two columns. So the totals in the right two columns are the total of the city revenue. You can see the 118,000 for the CFC footprint and the 255,000 for the 344th Street footprint. But the two other big jurisdictions that receive property tax revenues are the Federal Way School District and the South King Fire and Rescue, and they stand to lose property tax. Stand to lose property tax revenue also as a result of this. These private uses being replaced by a tax exempt nonprofit use. So the total government services that are that would have foregone revenue or a revenue impact, potential revenue impact, the total universe from which the OMF would influence things is about 161,000 for CFC and over 500,000 for the 344 site, the more industrial site. With the again, the surface water management fees, it might not. There would be revenue coming from the OMF facility as well. But with tax revenue, particularly with the state shared revenue property tax, we know that would be foregone, and there would not be a retail sales presence in the OMF area, even though the OMF would buy some amount of retail, make purchases in the area. We don't know what percentage of that would be inside Federal Way or outside Federal Way. So we can't count on that. So this shows how the numbers are spread out. Basically, I would focus on for the city, I would focus on the 88,000 total for the CFC and the 214,000 total for the 344 footprint. Now, I believe that the numbers won't be as bad for the new alignment of the 344th footprint. The reason is that by reorienting it, the Sound Transit was able to spare a group of businesses along the western side, closer to Pacific Highway. And those do generate retail sales and they generate property tax revenue. So it would take more of the land that is now owned by CFC, particularly that multifamily zone area that is currently undeveloped. But it would be more favorable than what you see right here. I think I think very much there will still be a greater impact from the 344 site. I think the relative position won't change, but the difference won't be as large as we saw in the numbers from last year with the other orientation. There are some other things to pay attention to. One is jobs. There are about 320 jobs, the average labor income of 77,000 at the 344 site. And the CFC site has fewer jobs, 228 jobs, with an average labor income of 63,000. The Sound Transit reports that it would bring about 300 jobs, which is in between these two. And given the reduced amount of displacement in the new orientation, it might well be a net benefit in terms of the number of jobs. And there's Sound Transit says that they will be relatively high-paying wages, which is easy to believe. Essentially, the type of use for an OMF is not so different from the type of industrial use that we have in the 344 site. So in terms of average wages, in terms of the amount of impervious surface, I don't see a big difference for those particular variables. Developable land, there are about 6 vacant properties in the 344 site, and the CFC footprint has a total of 4 vacant properties, but with 22 acres spread across industrial, commercial, multifamily. That is where there's the most undeveloped land. And because of the reorientation of the 344 site, a lot of the vacant land, the developable land, is now in both. It's in both the and the CFC parcel. So
Let me just interrupt just for a second. I see Councilmember Sefa Dawson has her hand up.
okay.
Councilmember Sefa Dawson, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, if we look at the revenue comparison,
Mhm.
the shared footprint, at 53,000, a little over 53, is it fair for us to add that to both footprints to
No.
come up with a total, or is it already included?
It's already included.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for clarifying. I mentioned that there are vacant lands that are developable. We are in the process of what is was available to be built at some time in the future with the highest and best use for those parcels. And we'll have that ready in time for the requirement for the city to submit its comments to Sound Transit on the DEIS. So that's my presentation. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to consider more questions.
Okay. Council President Honda.
Thank you. Gordon, Sound Transit is now saying that they are going to provide 470 jobs, I believe. Is that correct,
Okay.
Ryan?
I have not heard that.
Because they expanded the sites.
Yeah, the council president's Gordon is bringing up a new apprenticeship program that Sound Transit introduced as part of the DEIS, but I don't have the table in front of me as to the number. 420 to 470 sounds right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll take that into account when we'll be preparing a new revised memo to take into account the new configuration. We can, Ryan, if you can send me the updated data, the jobs, I can incorporate that also.
I also have a question on how you found out about the jobs at the Garage Town, because I know that there's different, the owners there have different businesses there. So did you take into account those jobs?
What we did was we relied on a database called Esri Business Analytics. and they maintain a database of economic activity. So for retail sales and for jobs, we depended on that particular source. For property tax, we depended on the county. That's the easy one. But for retail sales and population, that data came from Esri Business Analytics.
And
By the way, Esri doesn't allow you to have a really small area. I think it's a privacy concern. So they'll give you data for a larger area, and that's the reason there's no information on the shared footprint. It was too small an area for Esri to give us the data.
oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Tran.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Gordon, for your presentation. I do have a question regarding the noise and pollution impact to the people who live close by. Have we considered that?
No, we focused on, our particular analysis focused on the tax impact and the economic impact. But I'm going to go back to the visuals to agree that there are noise impacts. And I would say particularly with the revised orientation and the big church and school, the CFC church and school right across the street, there could well be a noise impact on adjacent businesses or residences that are not now taken as part of the the OMF development. So, but that would be an additional consideration that we haven't been able to quantify.
Yeah, I would
Mayor?
suggest that we include that.
Mayor, can I
Thank
jump in
you.
for a second?
Yeah, please do.
So, Councilmember Tran, the FCS studies groups of our FCS group's study of work was limited to the tax impacts as well as the opportunity cost analysis. So I think your question is really geared towards the next presentation. The technical comments have been prepared towards staff or from staff, and I think it'll get answered as part of that.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Seeing no other comments at this stage, why don't I at this point turn it over to EJ for that summary of technical comments prepared by city staff. EJ.
Sure. Good evening, Mayor, Council President, members of Council. So there's two additional items on the agenda for tonight, and one is the technical comments that I just referenced, as well as the second is the technical or the city preferred letter from Council. And just as way of background, this is the same process that we followed for the federal Waylink extension when we reviewed their draft environmental impact statement as well as their final environmental impact statement. And what we did for both of those is we ended up preparing effectively two letters. One was the preferred alternative letter from the mayor and council, which is also before you tonight. And then the second was a technical review. So the technical review comes from city staff, and it is on par with a review done as if they had submit a permit application. So it goes through the city codes, it goes through our policies, it goes through zoning, and it's just an objective here. You didn't meet this code, you didn't incorporate this, you need to do that sort of a thing, as opposed to necessarily a policy position, which is what council is taking. So as a city, we submit both of those documents, and what we're doing is we're following the same process that we followed for Federal Waylink extension, where tonight we're providing a briefing of kind of the high-level comments that staff have identified so far, and to Council Member Tran's points, he's already found one of them. But so it's for information and it's for your consideration as you consider the policy decision and the city preferred alternative later in this meeting and during the regular meeting. So with that, I will turn it over to Ryan Medlin to actually go through the technical comments and the presentation.
All right. Thank you, EJ. All right. So as EJ mentioned, I'm going to kind of provide a status on some of the staff review comments that have come in. The current review status of the review is it's still ongoing. But the purpose of this presentation is to provide some overview of the comments we've come up with to date. For this presentation, I've kind of organized it into what I call procedural concerns, some key transportation impacts, and then a general discussion of some land use impacts. So we're reviewing this across multiple city departments, mostly in public works and community development, but we've also spoken to park staff and as well as police department staff to try and get a comprehensive look at it as far as how it impacts the city. Again, the review is not complete, and the goal tonight is to just highlight some of the key issues that we've found so far. We have consultants that are assisting us this. We have FCS Group, as you just heard, helping us with the fiscal and economic impacts, as well as Transpo Group that looked over the transportation technical report and the DEIS appendix. And ultimately, as EJ mentioned, this will end in a technical letter that we send to Sound Transit for incorporation into the DEIS records that we would expect to see addressed in the final EIS. So starting with procedural concerns, one of the top things we've seen is that cost is very forward in this DEIS in terms of construction cost, operating costs, and frankly, it's clear that the Midway landfill is being presented as more expensive, but what that's missing is that cost is not an environmental impact under SEPA. So the DEIS is a SEPA document, and there is administrative code that the SEPA is supposed to be prepared under, or the DEIS is supposed to be prepared in accordance with. and cost is not an environmental impact with this. So we would prefer if the preferred alternative could be picked based on the environmental impacts as opposed to the cost for that reason, or at least have the cost presented in a manner that's not so blatant about that it's being prioritized. But even if it were an impact, it's also important to note that the level of detail presented is not commensurate with this implied importance. We have minimal information on operating costs as well as inadequate information on construction costs for each alternative to do a fair comparison. Yet we're given semi-precise dollar figures to make it seem like that the impact is definite or the cost has probably been analyzed in greater detail than it can be at a 10% design. And we also think that while the main line can be built, it has not been built, and that Sound Transit shouldn't be presumptive about the fact that it will be built as being put forth in these OMF South design plans. So a little bit of a cart before the horse, I guess, would be the analogy for that point. Transportation impacts. This is probably one of the more significant environmental impacts that we've been aware of for a while. So we've been looking at it close with the DEIS. That's one of the reasons we had Transpo group kind of helping us out on the technical appendix. So the red hatching in this image is the area that Sound Transit is proposing to have a public roadway that's vacated or a public right-of-way that's vacated in one of the alternatives. Neither of them proposes all of these right-of-ways, but effectively they both lose the same connection of 336 to 344th using 20th and some of those smaller streets. These vacations would ultimately require council approval, which takes time, and the vacation process, even if it moved forward, would take 18 to 24 months, which would challenge their construction timeline. And basically, it's not written into their current schedule because there's some restrictions on when they would be able to appeal to have these right-of-ways vacated as well. So considering the loss of those roads and the lack of new roads being put in to replace them, the project as presented would be unable to meet block perimeter requirements for the city that would be expected of any other developer. Typically, vehicle access points are expected. It's a 2,600 maximum, and they would far exceed that. And these removal of public streets would ultimately take away a connection, and it's a connection that would be not only left unmitigated, but change a lot of the transportation planning that's occurred to date. We have a project in the works to add shared lane markings to some of the streets for part of the bikeways plan. And 3 of the roads are identified in the comprehensive plan as minor collectors. And ultimately, we feel that police response times would be impacted because you'd lose that bypass of 20th Ave and some other minor collectors from 336 down to 344. So if there was a backup on Pacific Highway or 16th in that area, they would lose an alternate route. Which would ultimately affect response times. And basically, we feel that these impacts are either not mitigated or not analyzed enough to truly understand the impact within the DEIS. Some of the land use impacts, I won't repeat what FCS Group went over in detail, but there is an impact to the employment tax base to the city with the alternatives, as well as an opportunity cost regarding the vacant and underutilized land for future development. The DEIS does consider some cumulative impacts with regards to land use as far as how the OMF South relates to Tacoma Dome Link extension, but it doesn't consider it in the context of the commercial enterprise zone, which is the industrial zone for the city effectively. And it's the only zone where certain uses are permitted, such as Costco, Home Depot, and certain light industrial uses. And so that may make relocations more challenging. The DEIS does include a discussion about the impacts that transit can have on development that may be positive through transit-oriented development. but discussing it in terms of an increased density is not necessarily a one-for-one comparison when you're looking at a zone like the commercial enterprise zone. Like for instance, residential is currently not a permitted use in the CE zone, and shouldn't necessarily, and this DEIS shouldn't presume that it will be one day. So having them update their cumulative impacts analysis is one of the comments we're intent on making. Some other points that we plan to make is that the 336th Street site did not consider any potential impacts to the Weyerhaeuser campus viewshed. Were to go in along 336, they have a mainline lead track that's running right along that road. We also plan to do an in-depth review of how they work with our comprehensive plan policies they obviously, and from their standpoint, picked ones that are more favorable towards the project that they're trying to implement. So one of our jobs is to look at the rest of them and make sure that there's nothing that may be impactful to their project that they need to also consider. And there's a couple that will be having comments in order to basically request that they frame their presentation of our comprehensive plan policies differently. And the conceptual designs also have limited use for land use screening or other compatibility measures. Our essential public facilities code, which this would fall under, doesn't have defined mitigation measures for things like land use compatibility, but it does say that it has to provide an appropriate level of mitigation for the impact. So looking at a couple of key points on where these are coming from is if you look at the 336th Street site, the lead tracks run right along 336. And while there may be space there, ultimately these guideways are going to need some kind of planting clear zone, which will, as this design develops, because it's only 10% right now, it'll be harder to fit in plantings that we would typically expect to see for that kind of land use mitigation in there. And with the 344 site, it's the same kind of issue that you see that the landscape buffer is effectively missing on a portion of the east side of 20th there. And while it's a church today, it's still a multifamily zone. So a Sunday only use or a non-residential use for that matter can't be assumed to be there forever. So they should provide land use compatibility mitigation based on the zone, if nothing else. And to speak to Councilmember Tran's question in the last presentation regarding noise, I can tell you from the DEIS, their analysis only identifies a handful of properties to be what they call moderately impacted under Federal Transit Authority guidelines. Those properties are all located in the Belmore Park area. Their position is that the background noise for 336 in particular is high enough that they won't be further impacted by the OMF from a noise standpoint. So I don't have anything to add beyond that, but I wanted to speak to what I could about the noise question before we move on to the formal question period. So with that transition, I will open the floor to questions, and Mayor, pass it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Great job. Councilmember Seffa-Dawson.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all for the presentations. I do have other questions, but I want to go back to the revenue generation. And in this analysis, so anybody could answer that, but in this analysis, are utility tax and or Prop 1 tax considered in any way for this analysis?
Yes, utility tax was considered, but it looked like a draw. It looked like some types of taxes would be greater and some would be less. We don't have data for phone, and we just had water, sewer, and stormwater utility taxes. So we're making assumptions. But it looked like there would not be a significant change, or particularly, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. we don't know what the OMF usage of utilities would be. Between the two sites, that comparison between the 344th and the CFC site, it looked like it'd be about the same. So it didn't tilt that comparison at all.
Can you explain to me how that is then? Considering the activities are so vast and different, you still think that it's a drop and not significant difference between the two sites?
Between the two sites, we're assuming that the 344 site has warehouses, and the CFC site has a large building which uses more water and sewer, and but because of the lack of data on the power usage, we couldn't draw a comparison for that. But because the OMF site, OMF use is similar to an industrial use, we weren't able to, based on the data we had, which is surface water management, water, sewer, the differences between them were negligible. And we did look at the water and sewer and surface water.
Thank you.
Okay. Council President Honda.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. So I had asked Sound Transit when they presented to us about the cost of the track, building the track away from the Commons and down I-5 to the Federal Way sites, and they said they didn't take that into consideration, which I was a little surprised at, considering all the costs that they talk about at the Midway landfill site. So when the Sound Transit Board gets this document, when they're making a decision on what site to pick, it will then be the recommendation of the city to not include any of the costs in that, because they don't have an impact on the environment.
So there's two parts to that question. One is the Washington Administrative Code has a very prescriptive list of topics that an EIS is supposed to cover, and cost is not one of them. And that would be the essence of that comment. If they choose to consider cost, if they choose to, for instance, as it's presented in the executive summary, consider that the Midway landfill costs about $700 million to $1 billion more in construction, then the second part of our comment is that, they have a couple different ways they could address that. They could either not give us figures and just give us little dollar signs indicating which ones are higher cost and then a discussion of it, or they could consider it comprehensively so we could have a good discussion on which one's really more expensive. And the main line's one of those because they don't include the mainline construction costs under the Federal Way sites, under the grounds that Tacoma Dome Link will be built no matter what. And they also don't consider the operating costs of maintaining that main line in their operating costs. So there's some details that are unclear in the way that the DEIS is presented. So the purpose of our comment is to point out, hey, if this is under SEPA, then according to the Washington Administrative Code, you're supposed to be looking at environmental impacts that are clearly listed. But if you choose to look at costs and say that it's a significant impact somehow that needs to be considered, then you should provide a level of detail so that the discussion can be had fairly and holistically. Before I continue, I hope that somewhat answered your question. I don't want to get too far away from.
No, it does, because it seemed unfair to not include the cost of building a track that they don't need for to get to Federal Way, that they need to get from Federal Way to Tacoma, which will be some time in the distance that, in fact, it could be delayed because of lack of funding. And it just seemed wrong that they didn't include that when they were including all these other costs at Midway and making it so much more expensive.
Yep, agreed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I
Chelsea,
also have one other question.
Oh, please.
The Hylobus, that's going to be affected by either choice here in Federal Way. What are the impacts on the Hylobus for if these sites were chosen?
So the Hylobos will be, it'll be impacted either way, like you said, and there will be some relocation that's involved, and a lot of it will fall under the jurisdiction of the Army Corps, the extent that they'll have to relocate it. The Christian Faith Center has a little bit more of an impact because there's a second leg of the Hylobos to the west side of the Christian Faith Center site that's also impacted, that's not impacted on the 344 site. So even though you might think that intuitively that the 344 site impacts more of the Hylobos running along I-5, it's actually the Christian Faith Center. So I know one of the, while it doesn't relate to the Hylobos, along that same lines is there's significant wetlands and stormwater facilities existing there today. That one of the comments that our development services staff made was that they need to do a little closer analysis as to the groundwater levels, because in addition to the stream relocations, they're going to have to handle all that stormwater, which it's harder to infiltrate if you're taking wetland area and trying to shrink the surface area that the wetlands have to operate within. And so that has the potential to impact their footprint needs just by how much land they need for either wetland mitigation or stormwater management.
So one more question. So considering what's happening on the Weyerhaeuser IRG property and the fact that that could be developed in the wetlands there could be modified, how would that impact if our sites were chosen and the wetlands have to be modified on the Sound Transit property? They're right next to each other, so there's got to be some kind of a connection, right?
I don't know enough from a technical standpoint to answer that question. We'll be looking for the Army Corps permit. I'm actually going to see if Brian Davis heard that question, if he has anything to add.
Brian?
Yes. I think Ryan's correct. We need to see how they're connected in some way before assuming that they are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Council, any other questions before we move on to the next item? I don't see any. Okay, let's move on to council discussion and review of a draft letter. Again, this is also on for our city council meeting under our business under 7C. Let's see. EJ, are you going to drive that part of the discussion?
I believe so.
Okay.
So good evening, Mayor and Council again. So tonight, and I'm trying to share my screen. Just not cooperating. There it goes. So hopefully you can see that. Is that coming up on your screens as well?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. So tonight, and this is the same presentation that I have for the business agenda. So I will defer to the mayor and council if you want me to do the same presentation a second time or just discuss it at the council meeting, but whatever you would desire is fine.
EJ,
So-
let's do it again for everybody in the public because a lot of people
Sure.
won't be watching this.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So we're here tonight to talk about the preferred alternative and the authorization for a city preferred alternative, which will come from the mayor and council. So as I mentioned before, we as a city collectively submit two sets of comments to Sound Transit. One is from the mayor and council as a preferred alternative. And then the second is the technical review that you heard from Ryan, where we go through every one of the sites that they submit in the context of the city codes and policies and make technical comments. So those are not necessarily policy driven decisions in the context of this site is better than that site as much as a review of all of the sites. So the policy question that will be before you tonight is, should City Council approve a letter to the Sound Transit Board regarding the location of the proposed operations and maintenance facility south location? So the draft letter is also in your packet, and this covers 3 slides. So it is on your screen, and hopefully it is in your packet as well. And what I will do is I will read through it, and then we can open it to discussion. So, dear Sound Transit Board members, the City of Federal Way's mayor and council members have reviewed the findings of the draft environmental impact statement of the potential sites for the operation and maintenance facility south, also known as the OMF South, conducted a council study session with Sound Transit staff, have heard from our community, and have reviewed technical comments prepared by city staff. Our review has affirmed our belief that the Midway landfill needs to be identified as the preferred alternative and ultimately be the site selected for this facility, and the 2 Federal Way sites should be removed from further review. We recognize that Sound Transit is building new transit infrastructure to support sustainable growth in our region. In doing so, Sound Transit should not make a decision that will have a lasting negative impact. Environmental review by way of NEPA and SEPA was implemented at the federal and state levels to evaluate the impacts of government decisions in order to prevent them from causing unnecessary impacts to communities like those that the OMF South will have in Federal Way. The 336th Street site will remove a church, a school, and a daycare that serve our community, as well as residents and other businesses. The 344th site will remove multiple churches, 20 residences, and a dozen small businesses, including the Garagetown community that the DEIS presents as a single business, but is in fact made up of over 60 unique owners. The Midway landfill will displace significantly fewer businesses and employees, no residents, and no civic institutions. The DEIS presents a clear preferred alternative when the impacts are considered, and it is the Midway landfill. In accordance with NEPA and SEPA, cost is not an environmental impact. However, the prepared DEIS clearly shows that Sound Transit has elected to include cost within the decision matrix. In considering the overall impacts and a robust environmental review process, cost cannot be a factor in your decision. The impacts to the Federal Way sites are significant and will be far too detrimental to our community. The DEIS overtly assumes that the City of Federal Way will approve vacating public roads, that city staff will modify our development standards to permit this development that would not be approved of other public or private developers, or that adequate mitigation to these items could be found. We strongly object to Sound Transit's finding of regulatory certainty on behalf of the Federal Way sites by unilaterally assuming city approval. Additionally, Sound Transit does not have adequate authority to commit the City of Federal Way to a future legislative act in vacation of opened and utilized public rights of way. The City and Sound Transit have a shared interest in the success of the light rail system and have enjoyed a successful partnership on the Federal Way Link extension to date. We have seen and heard from Sound Transit a willingness to look to the future and make the decisions that are in the best interest for the future of this region. In this spirit, we ask that the Sound Transit Board remove the 2 Federal Way locations and select the Midway landfill as the preferred alternative and site of the new OMF South. City staff will provide additional technical comments under separate cover. Sincerely, and then it's got a block for the mayor and council signatures with CCs to CEO Rogoff, myself, Director Davis, and Ryan. So the options that will be before council is to approve the proposed letter, approve the letter with modifications by council, or to not approve the letter and provide direction. The mayor's recommendation will be number 1.
Okay. Councilmember Kochmar.
Thank you very much, Mayor. EJ, think that overtly assumes is, for me, doesn't mean, understand what overtly would mean, but if you were to say incorrectly assumes, that's very clear. In the second page. So rather than using the word overtly, incorrectly, I think would be a clearer meaning. I'm not sure why the word overtly is being used. Incorrectly assumes. They are assuming that we are going to approve what they want, and then that's an incorrect assumption. That's
EJ, what do you
just a
think?
suggestion.
Yeah.
I think it could be either one. I certainly understand Council Member Kochmar's point, and if that's the will of council and the mayor, I'm happy to change that. I think overtly assumes implies that they've skipped over the council process and leap to a conclusion that they don't have authority to make. So I think in that context, it's also accurate. But like I said, from my perspective, I think either is fine. So if there's a preference, whichever is completely fine.
Okay.
I just think for pedestrians such as the normal person that would read that, incorrect would be a more normal way of saying that. Thanks.
Okay. Any discussion on that, you guys? Any, or is there consensus that would be okay? Okay. I'm getting some nodding heads. Okay. Thank you. Let's go ahead and change it that way. Thank you. Councilmember Sefadasa, and then Council President Honda.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, EJ, and thank you for drafting this letter. It speaks volumes, and I do appreciate it. And I think it's clear that we don't want it here in Federal Way. My only question is, since we're not talking about the funding or the budgetary item, is it going to be one where we're going to be going back and forth in response and letters, because they are going to come back possibly and talk about the cost of the project if it goes to midway. So by not discussing yet, would it cause for us to have to go back and forth? It's just a question that I'm asking to see how it's going to,
So from a procedure under SEPA and NEPA, the goal is to document during the open comment period a declared position, which is the purpose of this, which is as of right now, the way it's written, it's that the council's preference is the Midway landfill and to remove the other two. So with that being said, that kind of negates a conversation about cost. And the focus of this letter is to get a very clear and documented position of the city incorporated into the official environmental impact statement process record, because that ultimately gets included in the final that Sound Transit becomes obligated to address, and they have to address to the satisfaction of NEPA if it follows the NEPA process. So I think we want to try to be as concise and declaratory, if that's a good description, of what we are trying to accomplish with this. So I would urge us staying away from getting into a debate inside the letter of, on the differences between the alternatives and stick with this site is the preferred alternative of the city and these sites should be removed, would be my professional advice.
Yeah, I agree and I appreciate it. I'm just saying, I also didn't want it to come up in a later conversation. But if you believe this would be the best way to not even bring it up, I'm completely supportive of it.
So, and frankly, it may come up in a later conversation. But, that being said, I think it's very important to be very, very clear and document a very specific position of the city council during the environmental impact open comment period and get that incorporated into the record. And if Sound Transit comes back and they want to have a discussion about it once that comment period is closed, certainly that's something we can do.
Okay. Council President Honda.
Oh, there it is. Okay. EJ, when before the draft came out, we had been told, and we were working with smaller sites for the OMF. And then when the draft came out, they were almost twice as large as how much land they needed. And that happened without a public process. How should that be included in the letter, that we didn't have a chance to have any input into that? Or is it?
So I'm going to give my opinion, and that Brian Davis is on the line. He's more familiar with SEPA at the state level. I'm actually going to ask him to chime in on that as well. We can certainly include anything that the council wants us to include, but from my perspective, we are, in the context of this letter, commenting specifically to the DEIS that's been presented. If we want to challenge the process that they've taken, I think that's outside of this. I think as a city, we have a responsibility to submit comment based on what they've provided as the official record, which gets, incorporated into the environmental process. So I think we could almost prepare a second letter addressing that if that is the desire of council, but I would encourage this to be a standalone in response to what they've submitted. But
Okay.
I would also defer to Brian on this topic as well.
Yeah,
Brian?
EJ, yeah, thank you, Mayor. EJ, I would concur with what you said on that.
So should we say anything about how they went from smaller pieces of land that they needed to these larger pieces of land and impacting more of our city? Is that, it seems like everything had been going to a public process, give us locations for this, up and down I-5 from Kent to Tacoma, and tell us what you think of each of these sites. And then all of a sudden these sites are chosen, the 3 sites are chosen, and we don't hear anything for a year or so, and they come to us and the sites have been expanded quite significantly. It seems to me that the public was not included in that, especially the city of Federal Way, because it will have such an impact on us.
Yeah, so we can, if I understand you correctly, the concern is that we were presented sites, and then without really any participation or notice, those sites were significantly bigger or changed to a larger impact or footprint than what was originally proposed to us. And so therefore we should, okay, gotcha. So yeah, I think to EJ's point earlier, we could review the comments that we've sent already at a staff level and determine if it covers the point that you're making. I think they might, but if not, we can incorporate that concern into the comments that we've made to the DEIS. Whether or not you want to incorporate that into the letter, that's up to the council, but we can certainly review and see if we have covered that in the comments that we've submitted already.
Okay. I just feel like we have to be up, they have to be upfront with us. And this was not done in a way that we had any say in it. I mean, it just seems like it was done behind our backs, and it will have a very negative effect on the city. So, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we'll review those. Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Councilor Kochmar.
Thank you, Mayor. I totally agree with Council President Honda. We had a total blackout of any information from the time that King County Councilmember Up the Grove complained about the Kent site over by Dick's Drive-In, and had, Dick's and their followers rightfully complain about the site behind Dick's Drive-In, and advocated on behalf of the Midway site. From that point to now, we had no input. In fact, I remember standing at a library and yelling at some poor Sound Transit staff member saying, we haven't been notified, and the elected officials in Federal Way as a group had not been notified. I was incensed. So at any rate, I don't even think I was on the council yet. But at any rate, I think it was very disingenuous of them. We had no idea as a group what was coming to Federal Way, especially with the OMF. And so I'm still incensed over the fact that they are picking an ONS site in Federal Way with practically no input from our citizens or from our. I will wager that there are a majority of our citizens don't even know what's going on. So anyway, I think a lot of the downtown, particularly with Belmar Mobile Home Park, all of that was being planned, and we had no notification in the community at all. So I'm still incensed. So I do think we need to write another letter. Thank you.
Okay. All right, council, any other comments on that? Okay, this will be once again on the business item agenda on 7C. And now we have public comment. Stephanie, do we have any public comment?
No, Mayor, we don't have anybody signed up for this meeting.
Okay. All right, we've got 23 minutes before the regular city council meeting begins at 6:30. Our business here being complete. Council, staff, thank you very much for a great special city council meeting. We will adjourn and reconvene in 23 minutes for our, actually 22 minutes now, for our 6:30 meeting. We're adjourned. Thank you.